there was one thing you mentioned on the discretionary side for systematic managers, and that was that a lot of the decisions are made on whether a system should be turned on or off, or a market should be taken off the roster or on the roster. I'm curious to know what that means from a discretionary perspective. Do they use data on it, or is it more like gut-based from the investment committee perspective? Because I've seen it in BlackRock, I've seen it in AHL, at least I've heard stories about all that. I'm curious to know what your experience there has been.
I mean, my opinion is any time, if you're working in a systematic business and you're making a decision and you're having to make qualitative judgments, you need to systematize that, right? Yeah. You should not be making, so in a good shop, and I'm probably allowed to say this, I think AHL is one of the better shops in this respect. The first time you make a decision, it might be very qualitative, but if that's a decision you're going to have to make, again, you should probably systematize it. And I'll give you an example. We were very worried in sort of 2011 about interest rates getting very, very low. Oh, how naive we were. And we were particularly worried about this weird phenomenon in kind of obscure parts of Europe, like Switzerland, where interest rates actually were getting very close to zero and possibly even negative. And we thought, well, how this clearly is. I mean, negative interest rates what is this magical mystery word? This makes no sense. Again, how naive we were. We had to make a judgment about whether to stop trading. I think it was the Euro Swiss LIBOR future, which was approaching a price of 100, which meant the rate was about to go below zero. So we had these kind of long discussions, and in the end, actually, I built a model basically which automatically reduced our position as interest rates approach zero in a particular market. And we had long debates about whether that limit should, where that threshold should be, whether it should be different for each market, because obviously in Japan, they'd had very low interest rates for a much longer period than in, say, the US. I decided that it should be kind of fixed for all countries, which is simpler as well as avoiding overfitting. And actually, in retrospect, was the right decision because, we've seen interest rates come down in the US as well to historically low levels. But then that was the important point here is that was now a system. It wasn't necessarily a piece of code. We didn't have to systematize it in that way, but it meant that if anyone had any discussion about whether we should turn a market off or reduce a position because of interest rates being very low, then we would say, well, we have this procedure in place. So if a client asked about it, we could say, well, we have this procedure in place. We have a system in place. So it's you'd no longer got a load of guys sitting around a table trying to make a discretionary decision, which could be subject to biases and so on and so forth. So you try and systematize it. So, I can think of many other examples. So for example, markets where volatility got very low, which has a couple of effects. Firstly, it means your leverage increases because we're volatility sizing our positions. Secondly, it means generally trading costs increase because the market's getting less volatile, but the tick size is not getting any smaller. So you're still paying the same spread. Risk adjusted, that spread is now much bigger and so it's a more costly market to trade. So you'd want to get out of those markets. Again, we the first time we had big kind of decisions about it. Then we put in place a system saying, right, the moment the volatility drops below this point, then we start cutting our position and we wait for it to go up to this level before we put it back in again. So that's how you can do it. I mean, obviously there are always going to be decisions coming up that are, non-systematic and, so they often relate to things that are not necessarily very market specific, like things like credit risk, like maybe there's a market you can only trade with one. We had this issue. There was a market we could only trade through MF Global. There were rumors on the street that MF Global were in trouble. Mr. Corzine was getting a bit handy with the gambling chips on the casino table. So we had to stop trading that market, and that was not a quantitative decision. That was purely like, this is a very specific business risk because these guys are going down.